Good evening, and thank you all for joining me. We are about to have our second Zoom session, part of the virtual tour project. And today we are going to go to a place that was the most strategic location in this part of the world for more than 1,000 years, and that will be Megiddo. In order to understand Megiddo, in order to understand the significance of it, and in order to understand how it affected the local lives of the people, we need to go further back in time than what we did last time. Last time we spoke about Caesarea, and I asked you to set your time clocks to the 1st century BCE. Today I'm asking you to go another 1,000 years earlier, or maybe 1,500 years. Megiddo was by far the most important location in the country, and in order to explain that better, we need to bring up the presentations. We'll see some slides, we'll see some maps. I'll try to fit in some short video clips as well, and I hope that you will enjoy the information. Let's go back then and bring up the presentation as we usually do. And I need to remind you some of the obvious things, but it's always interesting, always important to go back to the obvious. Let's bring up the map, and you know the map from last time if you were part of our first meeting. And I want to point at the arena, so to speak, of, let's call it, the world of the Old Testament, at least part of it. On one side of the region, here is Egypt and the River Nile, a gigantic water source. On the other side, the area of Mesopotamia between the Euphrates River and the Tigris. These were the cradle of the great civilizations of the world back then. And you do see that between the two, the desert separates them. And there is a narrow bottleneck or a land bridge which is connecting those empires and those civilizations. Which means that going from Egypt to Babylon or vice versa, one cannot take a shortcut right through here because this is a large desert, no water sources. So you need to follow the few water sources in the area, and that will bring you through a strip of land which is sandwiched between the Mediterranean Sea on one side, the desert on the other side, the land of Israel, and also known by the name of Canaan back then. You see the centrality of Megiddo that commands the most important crossroads. Well, this is the map to keep in mind and the map to understand. Let's bring up the timetable once again in order to show you the key eras in the country's history. Last week we were here, we spoke about the Roman era. Now we're going all the way to the beginning of the story, and we're going to focus on the days of the judges, the days of the monarchy, all the way to the days of the Assyrian conquest of the land. That basically brought Megiddo almost totally down, and the place was not as important later on in history. So we're going to cover a few hundreds of years in the region's history, and Megiddo will represent that. The name, by the way, Megiddo, means something which is connected to military, to army. In Hebrew, the term Gedud means a regiment. Maybe there's a connection between the two, because Megiddo is always connected to warfare, always connected to a chariot town, always connected to administration. It is mentioned 12 times in the scriptures, and that will be always the connection of it. Here is the gatehouse of Megiddo. Those of you that have been in the country may know that part of the city, and you see down below you the plains of Armageddon, and you will see what a great commanding post Megiddo had were the plains of Armageddon. On the upper right-hand side, you see something that was found in the excavation, but this is a replica. The original one was lost. It's made of ivory, and it has an inscription on it. It says to Shema, the servant of Jeroboam. That would be King Jeroboam II, and that was one of many pieces that were found in the area, unfortunately lost, but not before they made good replicas of it. So this is basically a replica of that piece made of ivory. So Megiddo will be our story for today, and we need to zoom in and look at that part of the country. You see the main highways and you see the crossroads of the world. That's the term that not I'm using, but we speak about Pharaoh, who was the ruler of the whole region. Well, the fact that Pharaoh considered Megiddo such an important asset, and the fact that he had to fight for it time after time after time shows that he was not the only player in the area. I'm going to go back to the map which I started with, and to point at some other challengers to occupy the area. It was Egypt's ambition always to have Canaan, but Egypt was not the only player. There was a mini empire called Mitanni in the 2nd millennium BC. And then, of course, the Hittites were interested in the very same place. And later on, the Assyrians, Babylonians. So the fact that the place is mentioned in Egyptian documents so often shows that the Egyptian army had to fight for it time after time. So it was conquered, taken from the Egyptians, so they can send the army the following year to recapture it. That's what this game in the area. Who will occupy Megiddo? And we have a lot of information because of that from other empires and other interested players in the area. So Megiddo was located halfway between the superpowers, and that will be the main significance of it. Let's go back now to where we left the presentation. Well, here is the map as we are zooming in, and I would like to elaborate just a little bit on the road system and its connection to topography. I'm going to point at the valley here, which is called the Jordan Valley on the map, but this valley is much longer than just to be the valley for the River Jordan. It's 4,000 miles long, starts in Turkey up here and goes all the way down to the Red Sea and the heart of Africa. That will be a very convenient artery to follow. So if you're coming from Mesopotamia and your destination is go to Egypt, you're going to take the valley and keep heading south. The problem is that on the length of 4,000 miles, if you want to cross the country and to connect with the Mediterranean, you must climb mountains. Sometimes it could be 4,000 feet in elevation. If you go further north to the area of Lebanon, that would be 7,000 feet in elevation. It can be 3,000 feet in elevation. You must climb mountains. That structure has one exception and one exception only. And that will be the break in the mountains here, or the gap in the mountains, that makes it possible for anybody who is interested to cross the land without confronting any topographical challenges except from here. And this is a little hill that you need to cross. It's not much of a challenge. You check with every general back then, and he will tell you the last thing he wants is to lead an army of 4 chariots through a narrow mountain path. Or check with a merchant. They did not want to lead their camels through rocky terrain. Everybody wanted to stay down in the lowland. And the only possibility in a distance of 4,000 miles to cross the country, connect with the Mediterranean highway, will be this gap in the mountain. Let me put it this way. If this gap was not here, the story of Israel would have been a totally different story. And you understand that every entrance to the valley had to be well guarded, well protected, and Megiddo for a long time was the gatekeeper, if you wish. So this line here, the plains of Armageddon, the Egyptians considered to be the gateway to Egypt. Anybody that came from the north believed that this is the gateway to their kingdom, which made that the biggest battlefield in human history. More wars were fought in the plains of Armageddon than any other place in the planet. And of course, you all know Christian eschatology, the last one, the plains of Armageddon will host the last climatic battle that the book of Revelation speaks about as well. So that will be the map, and these will be the things to understand. And these are just general information, and we'll still speak about general information before we go to speak about Megiddo in details. Let me also present another concept which is important to understand in this part of the world. What you see in front of you will be the hill of Megiddo, but this is not a natural hill, it's a man-made hill. We have about 200 such locations all over the country. It's very typical to the Middle East area. You won't find these formations in places that are rich with water. And the reason was this: you need to have a water source. And before the mankind learned how to carry water from place to place by aqueducts or by viaducts, before people learned how to carry rainwater from place to place, you are limited to one location, the spring. If you take a blank map of this country and you mark on it the springs and you mark on it the highways, guess where you would find the bigger sites? A spring that flows by the highway. So Megiddo is just one example out of many. Well, let's say that you located that place and you build a town. And since you locate yourself on the highway, sooner or later an army is going to cross your country and is going to conquer your city. You usually set it on fire. Well, the conqueror, the victor, also wants to fortify the place because of its significance. And now you have to deal with a pile of ruins. And the only way to do that, because you're limited to the same location, keep in mind, because of the spring. If there was a river, you don't have to build a town upon a town. You go up or down the current, you find a nice place on the banks of the river, you have water everywhere. Not here. Here you're limited to one location. So you're building your town above the old one. You bring some dirt from the area, you cover the old ruin, you tighten it to make a nice platform, and you build a town above. And if that happens 25 times, 28 times, you end up with a hill, which is basically man-made, made of civilizations, one above the other. When you live such a way of life with such a idea of that you build your towns one above the other, you need to confront two issues almost right away. Every additional layer, the top is shrinking because they're going to build now heavy walls and you're going to build them on top of ruins. And if you build it right above the ancient wall, it's not very stable. So you want to move the new wall a little bit inside to add more stability to the foundation. And the next one, a little bit inside. As you're getting higher and higher, you may be more protected because you're high above the valley, but also the property or the land is shrinking. There will come a time that you just don't have enough room on top of the hill to accommodate the facilities of a town, of a fortress, or basically anything. Challenge number two, the higher you go, the further away you go from the spring. The spring flows outside the walls, down at the bottom. How do you get from your town, which is up here in days of war, down to the waterhole? In times of peace, every city had the water gate. A flight of stairs will go down to the spring, and you would go to take water whenever needed. But now you have a big challenge. The problem is that your spring is outside the walls of the city and way down below here. And therefore you have to cover it, to camouflage it somehow that the enemy won't find it. So these are the two challenges that the city engineers had to consider with every additional layer. However, the gates of the city, and usually one gate for a fortress, will be located one above the other, because the access road came to a certain place in the new wall. You may have to elevate the last section of the access road, but you want to build the gates one above the other, and that helps today. Today, when they start digging such a site, they always start by the gate, and that's why so many gates were discovered in excavations. You take a bird's view of the site, you can always identify where the gate used to be, because there will be a little depression on the slopes of the hill, and that's where you start your dig. So that's how 200 sites in the country look like, and Megiddo was one of them. But that principle of layers is very important to understand. Let me say something about identifying locations. The Bible, the Old Testament for that matter, mentions 475 names of places. 475. And these places, sometimes we do not identify today because very seldom you find a place that will have a sign that says this was that and that and that. So the question is, how do we know? Many locations today do not carry the same name anymore. We speak about the Greek language that was dominant, so places were named in Greek, and then in Arabic and in Hebrew. So how can you make that connection? The Bible doesn't give us enough data. The Bible is not a book of geography. And for that reason, we need to be careful before we authenticate a site to say we know the location beyond any doubt. The way to do that is by using other sources. When you go to Egypt, or you go to Assyria, and you read the chronicles of the kingdom, every pharaoh, every king had a big entourage, among which there were scribes, professional scribes, and they will give a daily report about what was the army doing, including marching from place to place, arriving to a certain location. So if you read the description of one of those scribes, and the same description follows time after time over hundreds of years, you can begin to point at places and to say, okay, this is it, because it's mentioned in so many documents, it has to be the one. And therefore, there's no question about Megiddo. Megiddo is one of the places that was identified beyond any doubt. And we have enough information to testify how important the place was. Let me bring up some of those evidences, so to speak. Something from Egypt. It was called the execration texts. And these were texts that were written on clay. I'm going to skip this one to zoom in to show you. These look like human figurines. They have, the hands are tied behind the back, so maybe they have no hands. And that was a tradition that the Egyptian army used to go to do before they march to battle against a certain enemy. They write the name of the enemy on these clay dolls or clay figurines, or we smash it in front of the army. It was a whole procedure, as we found in other places. It was breaking them, spitting on them, stomping them, saturate them in urine, and then bury them. Well, that was the whole idea. Hopefully that will happen to the enemy in the battlefield as well, which means that Megiddo was taken by somebody else and the Egyptians had to recapture it. the name of Megiddo as an enemy of Egypt is found on those documents more than once. Another evidence that we have is coming from the letters of El Amarna, those tablets. In 1878, an Egyptian farmer was farming his field in the town of El Amarna in Egypt, and the plow pulled out from the ground one of those tablets that were written in cuneiform writing. He did not know that, but he just discovered the archive of the Egyptian Foreign Office from the 14th century BCE. 381 tablets. Pharaoh is corresponding with the kings that he was basically dominating in Canaan. And you can learn from the language how aggressive is Pharaoh in his approach and how submissive are the local rulers. 6 of those letters were sent to the leader, or not a king, the title was not king, but to the leader or governor of Megiddo. So once again, the place was well documented. 15th century BC, Pharaoh Thutmose, he's called by historians the Napoleon of Egypt, is also giving us a description. He led 16 campaigns into Canaan. The third one was more significant, and this is the most ancient, detailed description of a battle that was recorded historically, was the battle around Megiddo, and you find that on the walls of the temple in Karnak in Egypt. Another Egyptian document is coming from Shishak campaign. The Bible speaks about him as well. After the death of Solomon, the kingdom was divided, and the Egyptian pharaoh took full advantage of it, and he led an army into Israel, and he went all the way to Megiddo. So Megiddo is mentioned as one of the places he conquered, also on the temple in Karnak. By the way, he left a stele, as they call it, behind him in Megiddo. That was the objective of the campaign, and that was as far as Pharaoh got to. So as you understand, we have enough information regarding Megiddo to authenticate the place, how important it was. Let's start touring then the site. We'll go to the key locations. It was excavated a couple of times. The first time was by a team led by a German trained engineer and an amateur archaeologist by the name of Gottlieb Schumacher. That was the first professional dig maybe in the world. You need to know that archaeology is not a hard science. And back then, there was no really knowledge about layers, about cataloging the pieces of pottery. It was quite simple. Nothing today is using the same methods as back then, but he was the first one to excavate the place. And then there was a team from the University of Chicago that caused a lot of damage while digging as well. That was the way to dig back then. You need to understand that in order to complete such a dig, you have to peel it off like an onion, layer after layer. And what the team from Chicago did is taking a slice out of the cake, so to speak, and going all the way down to bedrock. Today, you don't do things anymore like that in excavations. And from 1960, Israeli universities are responsible to excavate. It was a chariot town, and therefore it had an entrance for pedestrians, as you can tell. And this staircase is about 4,000 years old. It goes deep all the way down to the valley. The walls of Megiddo towering high above you, and you do have a great commanding post watching any pedestrian that will come. Because the gate to the town for the chariots was a wide opening, as you can tell, in the wall. And you do see the entrance was through here. The chariots could not maneuver through a narrow gatehouse. It had to be an opening in the wall, which made this part of town vulnerable. Let me try to bring up one of those video clips that I would like to show you and see how that works. So please stay with me for a minute, and we're going to bring that up, and let's see, hope that you can hear that. Functioning. All right, it is muted, so I need somehow to unmute it. Let's see. Okay, we'll go back to the beginning of it and see how that works. So bear with me for a minute. Okay, here we go. Standing inside the gatehouse, we can take a closer look at some of the elements that make the structure so amazing. Number one, you can clearly see that the foundations of the structure are made of stone, which is not a local one. Everything is made of limestone, which is the local stone that the Israelites used to quarry in order to build what was built in the country. But down over there, you see a black stone, which is volcanic soil. It's called basalt.
Well, somebody 3,500 years ago, before the human race had the tools made of iron, had to know where to find those stones, to realize they are tougher than the others, and to bring them over to carve them out so nicely so they can carry the heavy weight of the whole structure. Now we just walk by it without paying any attention, but we speak about quite an amazing discovery and points at a lot of knowledge that people had back then. Another thing that we need to notice will be the line over there, which is a line of reconstruction. Excavating sites in the country, everything is done by international regulations, and if you excavate anything and you want to reconstruct some of it, you have to mark the reconstruction line. And that's how it's marked, sometimes a black line on the walls, and sometimes a line of plaster. Another thing of significance is the pieces of wood that you see over there, and although it's under the reconstruction line, these are new. It was found with the undercut, and the scholars decided that that's how it used to look like, and that has some biblical references to that as well. We are told in the book of Ezra, when King Cyrus gives the proclamation that the Judeans can go back to Judah to rebuild the temple, it gives us even the way that the structure will be built. It speaks about layers of stone and layers of timber, and it's interesting to know that that's how it was designed here as well. The reason for the sandwich of the two was earthquakes. Timber will be a great shock absorber, and if you integrate or you make a sandwich of timber and stone, that may protect the structure from collapsing in the case of an earthquake, and many places in the country were designed in such a way. It still leaves the question, who was the person who conquered this town? Because here's what the Bible tells us. The Bible mentions in the book of Joshua, chapter 12, 31 cities conquered by the Israelites, including Megiddo. But we also know the place was not inhabited by the locals. It was in the land of Manasseh. Manasseh conquered the city, but for some reason they chose not to inhabit it, and for that reason the Canaanites occupied it once again, and somebody had to take it. Now, we are not given in the scriptures the person's name, but we can figure out quite easily. Since the last layer on the very top was designed and built in Solomon's days, and we do know that Solomon did not fight for the place. Solomon didn't fight for almost anything, losing most of the kingdom David conquered for him. We do know that was not in Saul's reign in the Israelite territory. It leaves only one option. It was King David, as he conquered the last enclaves of Canaanites and the last pockets of resistance in the kingdom that brought this town down. He was the one to conquer the structure that we are standing in, destroy the city, for his son Solomon to fill up the ruin and to build his chariot city as the last layer on the very top. So that would be a typical gatehouse of a chariot town and not of a city. You see the chambers for the guards on both ends, you see the access road climbing from over there, and of course the excellent commanding post over the valley, which would be the potential battlefield.
Okay, I hope that worked well and we're able to follow some of the information. Going back now to the presentation, and we're going to climb another layer. Another layer means that we are going to go up from this one and see what is on top. I don't have one picture to show you how they're standing one above the other. There's simply no way to take such a picture from the top, but that will be Solomon's Gate that was resting right above, right above this one. So they stand in a way one above the other. As we said, gates are built one above the other, but today we only see half of Solomon's Gates. The other half was standing here, but that have had to be removed, taken out in order to go one layer down and to find the gate that we just saw, and I went through. And therefore it's Solomon's Gate that stands above the old one, and that will be the entrance to town. For the last 2 years, by the way, they reconstructed that section as well. So today we see the gate once again, but this part was reassembled by the archaeologists only a couple of years ago. So we're going into town, and we're climbing now to the very top, which was built in Solomon's days. You see that layer of dirt right here. This is not bedrock. This was the dirt that Solomon's men carried from the valley all around and covered the ruin of this town for Solomon to add the last layer, and that will be the one that we're going to see. One of the most important places in Megiddo will be the cultic area. This is the largest one that was found in the whole Middle East. It's a big complex, 17 layers of high places, if you wish, or places of worship, one above the other. And when they did the excavations, it's interesting, they found about 80% of the bones of animals that were offered in this place were sheep and goat. I'm not claiming that these are kosher, and this was practiced by the Israelites as well, but maybe these were the animals that the Canaanites also sacrificed in the area. So this is a round structure, as you can tell, made of local stone that were just gathered from the fields, not hewn stone. Interesting. That's what the Bible commands to build the altar of the temple as well. Stones that you gather in the fields without any tools made of iron cutting them and to make them fit nicely one another. So that will be a must place in every town, a place of worship. And I would like to say one word about that in the biblical context. Well, God promises the nation still in the desert in Sinai that he's going to take them to a good land and he's going to choose a place, and that will be the one place of worship. Question is, how many years passed between the Israelites occupied the land and Jerusalem was chosen? And the answer is more than 400. And the question was, even back then, how are we supposed to worship the God that brought us out from the land of Egypt if he did not choose one central location? And the answer was, we're going to worship him in our hometown. We're going to worship him on high places. And the book of Judges is quick to admit that the Israelites did worship on high places, but in some places in the book of Judges, the Bible says that was before Jerusalem was chosen to be the one place of worship. Once Jerusalem was chosen, everything else was considered to be wrong. But then the problem wasn't that much worshiping high places. The problem was the images on high places. The Bible strictly forbids the worship of images. The second command is very clear, and therefore worshiping on high places was not the main problem. The problem was to worship images. So please make the distinction between the two. And by the way, just outside Megiddo, one of the kings of Israel died. The only king that the Bible has nothing negative to say about, that's King Josiah. The Bible criticizes all the kings of Israel and Judah, except for one. That's King Josiah. What gave him the credit was that he was the one that brought all the high places down and made Jerusalem the one place of worship. Tragically, he ended his life outside Megiddo when he was killed by the Egyptian pharaoh Necho, 609 BC. So we're going back now to the presentation and we'll carry on. So we speak about the cultic site, as you understand, that would be a must facility in every town, let alone a place like Megiddo that so many people fought for. Another aspect of Megiddo, which is usually ignored, is how rich was the valley around Megiddo. This is the same facility, by the way, but they found 2 grain silos in the area. Each one could contain about 450 cubic meters of grain, which is a lot. But again, the place also accommodated about 500 horses and a lot of soldiers as well, so that was needed. And you understand how rich was the valley. Even today, the plains of Armageddon, the plains of Jezreel, are the breadbasket almost for the state of Israel, and so it was back in the old days as well. Pharaoh tells us, the famous Moses, that he was hoping to capture Megiddo by surprise, but he did not. And the Egyptian troops had to lay siege around Megiddo for 7 months. And they ate whatever they could harvest in the fields in the area. So this is another aspect, not just the strategic significance, but the valley is very lush. And if you drain the swampy area there, you know how to carry water from place to place. That will be another big value for the valley. It's not a water cistern, as some people think by mistake. 2 staircases leading down, one from here, one from here. And just imagine everything is filled with grain. And that would be enough for the major posts from Solomon's days. The chariots and the stables, it was all about the chariot and the stables, of course. There were 2 complexes found, and a maximum number of horses such a place could accommodate is about 500, which means about 150 war chariots. Solomon was the one that established this army for the Israelites in David's days. The Bible says very clearly, David conquered many enemies. He captured many chariots. He never used them for battle. He hamstrung the horses, destroyed the chariots, kept only few of them with him in Jerusalem, but it was not part of David's army. So David conquered. Solomon that invested in the largest army in the area, 1,400 war chariots. That was an imperial force. Basically lost everything. And there was a biblical lesson in that as well, as the Bible tells us, some trust in horses, some trust in chariots, and you know how the verse ends. So David obeyed and conquered, and Solomon disobeyed and almost lost everything. You do see the mangers made of stone. These are genuine. This one is reconstructed. When you think about the manger in Bethlehem that baby Jesus was laid in, it wasn't made of timber or wood, it was made of stone, just like the manger here. So the stables complex, this is one, and the other one is overlooking the plains over there. But that was the key area or the key issue regarding all of Megiddo, was to house those chariots. And again, the Bible said in Solomon days 1400, and they were deployed in 3 major chariot cities, in Gezer, in Hazor, and Megiddo, and some the king kept in Jerusalem, the Bible tells us. The next one is the most important one for daily survival. That would be, of course, the water project. Well, the challenge is very obvious. An enemy is approaching. You cannot leave your town and go down to the spring. You have to find a way, usually underground, to go to your water source so the enemy won't find it. So when that happens, then you have to work in much haste because you know that the enemy is approaching, and only then you start executing your plan, your program. And the simple plan was that you're going to dig a shaft that will go all the way through all the ruins of the ancient Megiddos to get to the aquifer. And you hope that this will be filled with water, it's all rain-fed. But if there was no water in the aquifer, which happens, then you need to add another part to the tunnel and go to the very spring. Now you're going outside the walls of the city, underground, but everything was so well camouflaged by dirt here that the enemy could not find the entrance to the spring or the entrance to the city. So if you had enough water in the aquifer, you don't have to go the way to the spring. You come to the top of the shaft and you throw your skin, your bucket, and you carry water up to fill up the cistern. But keep in mind, Israel is a dry country. Rainy season is only 6 months a year, which means if it's not the rainy season, then you don't have water in the aquifer, you have to go to the spring. And if you fail to carry enough water in the rainy season to fill up the cisterns on top, and the long dry season begins, you may not survive. And therefore that was crucial. Since we speak about the military post, it was a soldier job in this area to carry enough water when there was water in the spring in order to fill up the cisterns up on top. I'm going to try to bring up another short video clip and see if I can do that. So please give me just a second. We're going to bring that up to speak about the water projects, and here it comes. Just a minute, be with you in just a second, and let's see how that works. It should work now. No, it's not working, so just a minute. Let's see what we can do here.
Well, we walked along the tunnel, and the tunnel brought us to the spring. You're not expecting a lot of water flowing out.
Okay, I'm trying once again. So once again, I'm asking you to bear with me. Looks like I forgot to do something here, so it will be up in just a minute. Okay, should be okay now. Still learning. As I said, it will take a few sessions of meetings for me to master that.
Well, we walked along the tunnel, and the tunnel brought us to the spring. You're not expecting a lot of water flowing out, I presume. And also, this is not the right season for that. We are now in the heat of the summer days in Israel, and therefore there's no rain for a month, and there won't be rain for another 2 or 3 months, which means that the spring, which is rain-fed, is just a little bit of mud down below you. However, in the rainy season, it happens every year. It's filled with water, it rises, and then it will flow out to the other side, which means that the whole tunnel had to be dug in an angle to carry water from this side to the other side. And in the rainy season, there was no need to go downstairs and come all the way here. People could carry the water from the top of the shaft on the other side. Sometimes, even these days, when you come in the wintertime, you cannot walk through because the tunnel is indeed flooded, and that happens every day or few days every year. So you do understand that unless there were big climate changes for the last 3,000 years or so, you were limited for a few months every year. You had enough water here to carry the water, to fill up the cisterns up on top, otherwise you will not survive. Looking up this way, you can also see where was the exit from the water shaft. And back in the old days, when there was no tunnel to the other side, this cave was filled with water. It would spill outside, and that's how the spring used to look like. But once you dig the tunnel to the other side and the water is rising, it won't fill up the cave. It will flow to the other side, and then the water will rise simultaneously on both shafts, the natural cave and the man-made pier that we saw on the other side.
Okay, well, it's working, and I'm going to use that. God willing, they started opening now the sites, so maybe I'll be able to go to the sites and bring that stuff for you. Well, let's move now to the second one. Well, that's what you just heard on the video as well, going through the tunnel. That was quite an accomplishment. You understand that chiseling was not the challenge. It's very soft rock. The challenge was how do you work from both hands and you meet halfway, because if you miss, you get 2 tunnels for the price of 1. And everything was done under the pressure of an approaching enemy. They dated to the days of King Ahab. I'm not sure what they base it on. But when I read the report the last time, there was no real evidence that Ahab was the one. But maybe it's possible that in the 9th century that structure was built. So you do understand that Ahab was also using the chariot town that Solomon built after the kingdom was divided. And Ahab was one of the mighty kings of the northern kingdom. We know that because of some documents found in Assyria. Not going there right now, but Ahab controlled a large area, and he was using that chariot city as well. And of course, in Christian eschatology, as all of you know, Megiddo plays a very important role. You do see the hill from here. It's about 20 acres in size and about 200 feet above the valley. And we spoke about 27 to 28 layers. If you go to Revelation chapter 16, verse 16, the Bible speaks about that climatic battle that will take place in the place of Armageddon. To remind you, Armageddon means the Mount of Megiddo, Mount as a man-made hill. And the place is so famous for being a battlefield that it only makes sense that that will be the stage for the last battle the Bible speaks about in Revelation 16:16. Just to show the beauty of the valley. And this picture is taken from Mount Carmel, basically. Here are the plains of Armageddon going from west to east. It's sea level on the western side, 1,000 feet below sea level. And the famous gap in the mountains that I showed you on the map earlier will be right here. The town of Megiddo, down this way. These will be the mountains of Samaria heading south, and these are the hills of Galilee. Nazareth, for example, will be someplace around here. Well, this will be basically it for today. And thank you once again for joining me. I hope that you enjoyed the presentation. I hope it was a blessing for you. Let me remind you, we're going to meet again, and that will be this Thursday. And we're going to go to see the place that you can truly call the cradle of Christianity, and that will be the Sea of Galilee. We're going to go to see the lake, to speak about the key locations around the Sea of Galilee, and that will continue our virtual tour in the country. Until then, stay safe, and may the God of Israel bless you all. Bye-bye.